Hi, everybody. This is Ed Cato. Welcome to our San Diego 2020 at-home panel. Today, we're going to talk about the intersection of academia and fandom. I've gathered together an array of smart, forward-thinking academics and leaders of the industry to talk about the things they're doing to really understand their views of what's going on today, what are some of the issues, and what's happening in the future. So we're really excited for this one. Let me start by introducing this group of panelists. Karen, would you please start us off?
My name's Karen Green. I am the curator for comics and cartoons at the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia University in New York.
Oh, thank you. That's great. And we also have from the West Coast, Rob Salkowitz. Rob, can you remind us a little bit about what you do and who you are?
Sure. My name is Rob Salkowitz. I'm a writer and sayer of things about comics, mostly in the pages of Forbes, ICV2, and Publishers Weekly. In this context, I teach comics as communication platform in the graduate program of communications at the University of Washington.
Fantastic. Good. Darlene Overbaugh, I know you quite well, and I've known you for a few years, but could you please introduce yourself for this audience?
Sure. My name is Darlene Overbaugh. I come at this from a little different angle. I am an events producer and researcher, particularly in the fan culture field. So I have worked on events in the Ithaca area along with Ed, but I'm currently researching the digital futures of fan culture of events.
Super. That's great. Frank Camuso, also in the central New York region, based out of Syracuse, New York, though. Could you please introduce yourself, Frank?
Yeah, my name is Frank Camuso, and I'm a graphic novelist, and I also teach at Syracuse University. The graphic novels I've done so far, I do a lot of kids' graphic novels. The series I have going on right now from Penguin Random House is Edison Beaker, Creature Seeker. So I'm working on the third one right now. And when I'm at SU, I teach comics. I teach history of comics and sequential illustration.
That's great. Frank, I've got to say, you have that class that I'm going to crash one time or another. Oftentimes you'll tell me your next topic and I'll be like, oh, that sounds like the best one.
Well, I had to, we can talk about this later, but I had to switch to online. So some of these will be available on tape, unfortunately.
Right. Very good. Very good. And we also have Paul Levitz. Paul, I know you started a fanzine and were an intern at DC Comics. Did you do anything else with your career after that?
Actually, I never was an intern.
Oh.
I missed that experience in life. I went straight on the masthead as an assistant editor.
I see.
That
ruined my joke.
I've done a bunch of stuff, pretty much anything in comics that you can do without being able to draw. I can't do that to save my life. When I got up from the desk after finishing up as president and publisher at DC about a decade ago, it was, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? And having had some wonderful teachers in the course of my education, I said, well, that could be fun. And despite the fact that I'm a college dropout, so I don't have any of the appropriate credentials, I've managed to convince a number of schools to let me ruin their kids' minds. So I've taught comics as a writing course. I've taught comics as a business of publishing course in Pace's Masters in Publishing program. I've taught comics as a literature course, and I've taught it at Cameron's fine institution as both literature and as part of their American Studies program.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, what a treat. What a treat. That's great. Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate your time during this crazy lockdown semester. We're recording this in June. Of course, it'll be released. Our audience is presumably watching this in July or some point after. We've just finished up a difficult semester with a lot of twists and turns. I'm very curious from our panelists, how was that last semester? How did it go? And do you have any reflection on it as we sit here in June of 2020? And I'll throw that open to whoever wants to start.
Actually, so the class I teach in the graduate program has a difficult format, even in person. It meets for 8 hours, Saturday, 9 to 5, every other week, 5 meetings for 40 hours. So even when you do that in person, you got to be pretty good on your time management and stuff like that. It's seminar style, so I usually get between, say, 8 to 15 students in that. And of course, I divide up the time and I have like guest speakers and workshops and student presentations. But to move that online, honestly, I was completely dreading it because just to ask somebody to sit there, even by moving some of the content into downloadable sections. So I would take some of my lecture notes, I would record it on PowerPoints and stuff like that and say, watch this on your own time, and make some of the class material that we would otherwise be sitting there watching stuff that they would do on their own. But even so, it seemed like it was going to be a challenge. And I got to credit my students. These guys really stepped up. Not only did they adapt very well to the online format, but in a situation where you've got all kinds of other things distracting you and all kinds of other stuff on your mind, a lot of these students are international students that were, couldn't be with their families and had all this other stuff going on. They were there for 5-6 hours a day, in these sessions, and it went at least as well as some of the in-person classes I've taught. And I was just stunned, and I give all the credit to the folks that put themselves into it, because if I was them, I wouldn't have been as good as they were.
Sure. Oh, that's great. That's great. Any other thoughts? Frank, how was it in Syracuse to transition?
Well, I had a different situation because because when it first started, we had a family emergency, so we got stuck in Nebraska. So I spent 2 months in Nebraska because things kind of got locked down around here or in New York State. So luckily, I brought my laptop and I put a bunch of files into my my AirDrop and things like that, and I was able to have all that information. But it was a challenge. I had to tape all the history of comics lectures, or the last 4, and that was weird because I'm used to just slides and kind of riffing off that, and instead it was just I had to over-explain things and kind of make sure the slides had all the information on that. So I had to go back and redo all the PowerPoints. It was actually a lot of work. The studio classes weren't so bad. I mean, I think the longest one we had was about 3 hours. I mean, 3 hours on Zoom is a long time. I mean, it's, so, but it was a lot more work than I thought it was going to be,
Yeah.
But, like I said, I think the students were very excited just to have something going on, and they were down with whatever we did, and they were pretty happy with it. They just want some form of normality,
Yeah.
So,
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, it was fun, but it was a lot of work.
Oh, good.
I don't actually teach in the summer or in the spring or fall, but I had just come back from a trip to Europe on March 11th and was about to buckle down and finish my syllabus for the summer course that I've been teaching for the last 6 years. And that Friday, we were sent home. We weren't quite sure what was going to happen. And over the weekend, we were told there's going to be a 4-hour window on Monday for you to come in and get whatever you need from the library to do work at home. And then the library will be completely shut down. Now, all of my personal comics library is in my office at work. And then, of course, Columbia's collection is also what I use to draw upon. I had no way of finishing the syllabus. I told them, I'm really sorry, I can't do this. And coincidentally, the person that they asked to replace me was Mr. Paul Levitz.
Yeah, that I would like to go back and hear and this will be our next one where you can tell us a little bit exactly about the class. But Paul, when you picked up that time, what was that like? And it looked like you got some good guest speakers too.
Well, the advantage of Zoom teaching is the advantage of being able to bring people in from far away without disrupting their lives nearly as much. I mean, we've had interesting people come in at Columbia, all of the courses that I've taught there, because the aura of Columbia, and occasionally there was even a budget to be able to give somebody some modest honorarium. But you know, you're still asking somebody to pull time out of their life. And back in the day, everyone was around New York when I came into comics, but certainly that is not true now. So it's very different. So when Karen gave up the class, I twisted it a little bit to adapt it to a version of the comics literature class that I've been teaching undergraduate at Pace for the last couple of years. But at Pace, I don't really use outside speakers for the literature class. Here, because of Zoom, I was able to. So Jerry Kraft was kind enough to come in as a guest speaker during the section of the course that starts out with the kids stuff. And you know, he was amazing and just lovely with the kids and shared a tremendous amount about his life.
Yeah.
And then this past week was in the middle of the sort of grown-up section of the grown-up fiction section of the course, where we do Watchmen and Sandman and Asterios Polyp. And the day I was doing Sandman, I just said, oh, you know, what the hell? And sent a text off to Neil to say, you know, I know you're on the Isle of Skye without Amanda and Ash. If you're bored tonight, come on by. And he was kind enough to drop in for about an hour, which was, of course, wonderful. You know, he's so smart, and we just had so much fun going back and forth on what mythology was and what story components make something into literature, and interacting with the students in a terrific way, because he's just so solid with people.
Oh,
I think you just became Professor of the Year, Paul.
Yeah.
Just show up in your class.
You know, it goes both ways over the years. I had in my writing course at a little liberal arts college called Manhattanville, maybe the first or second year I taught the course, I'll never forget this one. She seemed like an extremely little girl. I don't know whether she was just a freshman or she was just physically small, but I remember just the little voice perking up as I was talking in conversation. You mean you know Neil Gaiman? You know, at the other extreme of it, I've at least once on the student evaluations had one of the kids say, you know, he really drops a lot of names. Maybe he shouldn't do that. Sure. I teach mostly using things that my friends and my acquaintances have written, because I can go into greater depth behind the scenes of those things.
Well, and I think that's exactly it, that you know, people forget that professionals within the industry who become large names, you know, they are people. They are real people, and they, you know, they do have friends, they do have colleagues, and that's got to be difficult for people to remember, I think.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I think you're right, Darlene. It's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it's hard for people to remember because you idealize these people on some level. And I was a comic fan. I was a science fiction fan. I still remember being called into one of the editor's offices to be introduced to Isaac Asimov, and just sort of melting on the floor because that was the writing I had grown up on. I have no memory of anything that I said, because I don't think it was anything in a coherent sentence. But on the other hand, one of the things that I found fabulous in bringing in guest speakers over the years is to have kids hear the journey. Because you, as a kid, you meet these people as a finished and successful creature. Neil Gaiman is Neil Gaiman. Isaac Asimov was Isaac Asimov. But when you actually hear their life story, in many cases, you understand that Jerry Kraft was not only not an overnight success, but 30 years of self-publishing and working on other people's books before he became an author in his own right, clearly and cleanly, before he won the Newbery. that's great for the kids to hear, because none of us had a straight line path to what we did in life. And at that age, 20 something, right? It's really easy to have a fantasy that the tooth fairy is going to come by and is going to induct you into the Major League Baseball team or the graphic novel world, and you will be blessed and your entire life will proceed as the fantasy that you would ideally like it to be. And that doesn't work for most people. And even for those of us who were lucky enough to have the tooth fairy drop by, the path was nowhere near the straight line that we might have expected, even if we got to hit most of the stops along the way eventually.
Yeah.
You know, another aspect of that, though, Paul, is that for the most part, the Columbia students, I know that the ones I teach, and often the ones that you teach with the course that you co-teach with Jeremy, don't have a big comics background. They know comics from the movies. They know comics from Calvin and Hobbes. They know comics from like Batman the Animated Series, but they're not immersed in the world. So they don't understand that you are a big name. When that comment came across in your evaluation that you dropped names, I mentioned it to Jeremy and he said, don't they understand that his is a name that people drop? You know,
Right.
they don't get who you are. So they just think you're some schmo dropping all these names.
Yeah.
It's,
Well, and that was very much our experience, Ed.
Yeah. Talk to
You know,
them.
because our experience was that we co-taught a course together. Ed was like the business side and I was more of the events production side. But I happened to also come from a background of comics. So we had that even playing field. And we utilized that, you know, we had a split semester. So we had half the semester in person and then half the semester not in person. And interestingly enough, a week before our quarantine began, that was when we made the call March 13th.
Oh, yeah.
We're
Crazy.
supposed to have Ithacon 45 on the 22nd of March. So
Right. As part of
doing an
that,
event.
yeah, as part of the class, the kids also manage the Ithacon Comic Convention, the nation's second longest Comic Con, and we had to cancel that. And we were talking. It was right before it all hit. And we were kind of, you know, gee, should we do this? Should we not? And we made the call, and we had to justify it, right, to upper management. And then 3 days later, everybody was canceling everything.
Yeah, and it was a total synonymous time. I mean, it was weird because you could tell that upper management at the institution was making these decisions, but they weren't sure what they were doing either yet. But they weren't also communicating with us, and we were kind of making decisions as well. And we had the added bonus of it's a co-collaborated production. It's the institution, Ithaca College, as well as the Comic Book Club of Ithaca. So it's not just interfering with the academic world, it's interfering with the community. So it was all these moving parts. But we found ways we scrapped the syllabus.
Yeah.
Wrote it like within a few days because I knew that if the entirety of them producing the event was not going to happen, they were going to have to produce something else to be given a grade.
a lot of improvisation went on this term. If I could just talk to something that Paul said, because I think one of the advantages that we have teaching comics is that the industry, even though it's gotten a lot bigger, is, you know, it's something that you can kind of get your hands around. I don't necessarily have Neil Gaiman on speed dial, but like I had a situation where when you're not in a classroom situation, getting that interaction and getting that sort of engagement can be challenging. And every year, 40 to 50% of my students are from overseas, and some are from Asian countries that are not English first language. And the women in particular, there's sometimes a cultural barrier to get them to feel comfortable speaking up in class and engaging and stuff like that. So for the second class, I thought, let me see if I can break the ice here. So I just kind of on a whim reached out on Twitter to a graphic novelist named Shingyin Kur, who did a really delightful graphic novel last year called An American Dream, which is about her experiences doing the Route 66 road trip as a young queer Asian woman from Malaysia. And she's contemporary with the students. I mean, I would say she's in her mid to late 20s, and she came in, and it was like, as soon as they saw like this, it was very, very important to have faces that are not yours, you know, talking, and it instantly got everybody leaning forward, and she was very engaging, and it was, you know, kind of a way to give permission. And it's like, that was I had put her book on a top 10 list and stuff like that, so I had a little bit of interaction with her, and I could get, you know, have that opportunity to bring somebody like that in. In the fall, I teach a class on like marketing strategy and stuff like that. And it's like pulling teeth to get guest speakers, because I'm like, you know, hitting people up off of LinkedIn and like all of these weird ways. With comics, it's like we're all in the same family basically, and like we're all, you know, one or two connections away. So it's a huge advantage for teaching because you can pull stuff off the shelf and to make your classes better on the fly.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Just connecting with one another. I actually come from a theatrical background. So when you talk about family, that's very much the same case. When you come from a theater, I mean, you start to network with people, but it doesn't feel like networking, it's family.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's great. Let me ask a question. This kind of sparks about something that you said, Karen. When I was a kid, my dad took me to Cornell, and we went to the Cornell bookstore. And there was this book there, this crazy book called The Gospel According to Superman. But the cover had this Murphy Anderson, beautiful Murphy Anderson, the long-lived DC artist, this beautiful Murphy Anderson cover. And I knew it was like, gee, this is real. This is legit. Even at a young age, I knew it was legit. And then I thought, is this what college is like? Like you kind of read comic books, but they're, you know, but they're fancy or about religion. And I was, you know, so excited to go to college that day. And when I went, it didn't really work out. I'm very curious what you all find it like when students enroll in one of your courses. What are they expecting? What do they get? What are their reactions to have, you know, a course? And maybe for this section, it might be interesting if you could just, if you haven't already, give a little background on the type of course that you're teaching too. So Karen, would you mind starting us off, please?
Sure. I teach a summer course that I inherited from a grad student in the English department who designed it. And then when he finished his PhD and went on to teach at Penn, they asked me to take it over. And he called it Comics as Literature. He came from a literary theory background. I'm trained as an historian. My background's in medieval history. So I had you know, going down his list of just suggested paper topics, I didn't think even I could write any of them. So I turned it into more of a close reading course. Like, how does this medium work? What is the language of comics? What is it that comics do that allows them to tell the story in the way that, say, cinematography and soundtrack and sound effects, etc., do for film? And that's what it's evolved into. And eventually I changed the title from Comics as Literature to Comics, because you need a colon in academia, Comics, Reading the Medium. Because it's a summer course, I get students from our School of General Studies who are our returning students. So mostly they're local, they're working 9 to 5, because all of the undergrads from Columbia College and the engineering school are off doing internships or travel or whatever over the summer. They're gone. So I get a lot of slightly older, not much older, but slightly older students, and they don't have to follow all the same core requirements as the Columbia College and engineering students do. There is a kind of Classics of Western Civilization course called Literature Humanities, shortened to Lit Hum, that is part of Columbia's core. And general study students are allowed to take some other course to substitute for that. And inevitably, 90% of the students I get have decided to take my course to get out of having to take Lit Hum because they don't want to read, the Iliad and etc. I always tell them that I think this is a mistake because knowing that literature is going to allow them to appreciate the books that we read so much more. But, I'll take it. But they come in, they're not taking my course because they're crazed comics fans. They're taking the course because they want to finish their degree and get this requirement out of the way. So they come in with very little understanding of the medium. And I always start them with Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics and previously the article, now the book-length version of How to Read Nancy, Paul Karasik and Mark Newgarden's How to Read Nancy, because I want to give them a theoretical framework on which to pin all the vocabulary and concepts that we're going to entertain. And I ask them to write a response paper once a week. We meet twice a week for 3 hours of class, so 6 hours a week for 6 weeks. Yeah, it's pretty intense. So I asked them to write just a 1 or 2 page response paper based on what we've read or discussed that week. And the responses that first week are so gratifying, first of all, but they're all like, I had no idea that comics were such a complex and sophisticated art form. This is amazing. Scott McCloud said this, and Newgarden and Karasik said that, and after that, it's kind of clear sailing because they refer back to McCloud without my prompting constantly through the rest of the course. So that's my experience.
What a riot! That's great.
Yeah, we also used Understanding Comics because that's how there's inevitably kids in the courses that are, really into it. There's usually 2 or 3. Then there's others that are just fulfilling a requirement, like you said. And little did they know that they were going to end up taking the course that was actually going to be harder, or at least more. They're going to expand themselves in a way. I actually utilize Scott McCloud's book and draw parallels between comics and events. The gutter is where things happen that you don't know are happening, and that's the backbone of an event. That there are planning and design and ideas happening in that gutter, and there's all different ways of approaching it. But.
Yeah, all your in like that gutter thing I thought was brilliant. I learned a lot from co-teaching with you. That was great.
Yeah, what a great idea.
Yeah. Frank, how about you? What do people come in expecting? Students come in expecting, and how would you classify your students?
So the 2 main classes I teach are 2 of the ones I teach are drawing comics. And I think a lot of people come in thinking they're going to learn how to draw big feet and funny noses and things like that. And what I really do is I teach more about like the language of comics and, what happens and, just kind of getting to the point where they understand that comics is a language. It's a form of communication. So that is really what I do. And I don't care. I mean, I get a lot of, people outside the art major coming in to take this class because I don't care what you draw like. I just care how you communicate and tell your story. And that is really the emphasis of that. And it's always a little hard after the first couple crits because, I'll have illustration majors and people like that in there who are amazing artists. And then I'll have some people in there who are writing majors or poli-sci majors and just want to communicate. And they're putting their little scribbles up against that. But, most of their stuff is better because it gets to the point more. Most of these illustrators, they overdraw, and a lot of the other folks just put in what needs to be done. And that's comics, right? I mean, comics is just the raw essence of that. So that's that class. And then history of comics, I really kind of show them that, we go back, we start at cave paintings and we move up to current day. And I just show them that these things didn't exist in a bubble, that there's a reason why we tell stories, and there's a reason why we tell stories pictorially. And, you know, and they kind of, the first couple's lectures are kind of hard because we do a lot of, you know, I think the first lecture takes us up to the mid 1800s, you know, which is a lot of time, but there wasn't a lot of drawing going on. So, you know, especially comics. And then the second lecture is, you know, we get into the Yellow Kid and things like that. And then when we get into about the 20s and 30s, when we start getting into the funnies, that's when it pops. And then of course, when we get in the golden age, that's when everybody, you know, it starts their cultural references at that point that they really know.
Yeah.
But it's weird because, you know, all these, you know, the students now probably weren't born in the 21st century, you know, a lot of these kids. So, you know, so it's their point of reference is, you know, like my sweet spot is always, you know, late Silver Age, Bronze Age. I mean, you know, their stuff is like, you know,
Web comics.
yeah, webcomics, yeah, exactly. You know, and things like that happened like 1995, like Image Comics is like, whoa, that's like old stuff. That's like World War II, you know? So it's always, you know, these kids have never read comic strips in the newspaper. They've never read Calvin and Hobbes, you know? Not, they probably have new ones, but like in the heyday, you know, so.
Right. Yeah. Maybe never in that newspaper format, just in.
Yeah. So it's a really, you know, it's explaining a lot of times about the print medium is something that they, you know, you have to do. You're like, well, you know, it was really cheap and it was, so it's a really, you know, there are a lot of aesthetics going on there that need to be covered. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Do they, do your students, do you find your students got what they thought it was, or is it a different class once they're hip deep, Frank?
Yeah, no, I think they didn't realize that sometimes that how deep it was, you know. I mean, it's hard because we can't really do deep dives because there's so much content,
Sure.
you know, but I do think they, you know, there are a few aha moments, you know, in the course, you know, especially when I talk about like the first time we talk about the Golden Age and Superman and how all these are just, it's just mythology, right? And when they start seeing that, and like I make the, you know, the Christ analysis and the Moses analysis, that blows their mind. You know, the virgin birth stuff, they're just like, what? You know, they can't understand. There's like an audible gasp because I'll show like Superman going like this, right? Then the next slide, I'll show Jesus with the Sacred Heart, you know, and where he's like this or something. I can't remember what the slide is, but there's an audible gasp at that point. And I'm like, yeah, it's the same character, guys. You know, roughly.
Yeah, I love it.
Oh, yeah, it's Paul. Sorry.
No, that's great. Paul, could you tell us a little bit about the type of students you tend to reel in?
Well, the mixture of courses is very different. So when I teach writing the graphic novel, probably half the kids in that class know something about who I am and know something about comics. The other half are either would be screenwriters, would be playwrights, would be writers in general, who are just looking to expand their writing skills. And, you know, as I jokingly say, I took some courses because they were Tuesday at 1 o'clock. You know, you're not going to offend me by telling me you took this because it fit your schedule.
Sure.
When I teach the business of comics publishing to the master's students in a publishing program, the vast majority of them don't know anything about comics. They just know, oh, graphic novels are something that supposedly is a good thing now in publishing. And this, I've heard good things about this elective. And I really treat it as a course in the philosophy of being a publisher. Just using the example of how the comics industry works. You have to think about this, you have to think about that, building ultimately to a final project of them pitching a project as though they were pitching it to an editorial meeting to try and sell the project within the organization. Give them a little real world experience. When I teach comics as lit, I get almost no kids who know anything much about comics.
Mm-hmm.
And that's much more similar to what Karen was talking about, whether it's traditional undergrads or the general studies kids. You know, this sounds better than a Shakespeare course. You how tough can comics be? And along
Sure.
the way,
Surprised.
they find out there's more meat in it
Yeah.
than they're expecting. The other thing that I have as an advantage or disadvantage in this is I had the pleasure a few years ago of being invited to co-author the second edition of what was the first college textbook on comics with two real professors. And I got to learn that college textbooks pay roughly the same as fanzines. Except I used to give the guys who worked on my fanzine pizzas and grape sodas, and I don't think I got any pizza or grape soda out of this deal. And I'm not sure I could afford it on my royalty checks. But
You didn't even tenure.
Did you even get tenure?
yeah. But I'm able to lean on that a little bit for the portion of the course that I work through on history, because much like what Frank was talking about, maybe the balance is a little different because I don't do a history of comics course. But for any of these courses, I want to do at least a day, 2 days of Thomas Nast through not just Will Eisner, but the whole evolution of the graphic novel moment that we're in now. Because it gives them some perspective on it. And I do the Understanding Comics, I'll do the How to Read Nancy for the lit courses. Less so if I'm in the business of comics side of it. Less so if I'm writing of comics. I don't use the How to Read Nancy, but I'll certainly use McCloud. Scott's so smart, and it's just such an interesting way of looking at the field. And an awful lot of the writing comics project is just workshopping their work. It's each iteration of the script. I expect them to turn out usually about 30 pages of a graphic novel script by the end of the term. And I've had 2 or 3 that I think were publishable. I don't know if the kids actually did anything to follow through, but maybe it'll go in a draw and come out of a draw 5 or 6 years later, and they'll pull it out, because that often happens with writers.
Sure. Great. Good. Rob,
Yes.
I don't think we had your.
Yeah. So I teach in this very unusual program at the University of Washington. Frankly, I wish it was around when I was young enough to take it and not teach in it. So it's a professional communications program. So it confers a master's of communications, which is like an MBA for communication professionals. So the students in the class are sometimes earlier mid-career, sometimes they're right out undergrad, but usually they've had a few years in the workforce, and they're in everything from like marketing, filmmakers, UX designers, documentary producers, content strategists, like all of this whole mixed bag of stuff. And in the program, they take classes in everything from like how to do like podcast production and interview techniques to design for visual communication, just all kinds of different things, and a lot of it around community engagement and stuff like that. So I have it always kills me when I see like comics being used in other media, like in advertising and stuff like that, from people that have no idea like what the hell they're doing. It's like, let's put the product in a cape and like, hey, it's comics, And so I feel like I am doing a little bit of ecology work here, a little bit of cleanup to get students thinking about it, as the rest of you guys are doing, to think of comics as a complicated medium, as a storytelling platform, and basically from the context that these folks are in the program is another tool in your arsenal, that if you're a storyteller, you don't have to be a cartoonist. So one of the things, I have a professional cartoonist come in one of the classes and actually talk about how they go about breaking down the story visually, how they work with a writer, what is appropriate feedback to give to an artist, what's the kind of stuff that an artist likes to figure out on their own versus what you as the writer need to do. Because there's not that many people in the class that come in with visual storytelling skills or drawing skills, or even have ambitions in that. So it's like, to me, it's more valuable to teach them from where you're sitting. Here's how that works. So for the first part of the class, like all you guys, I start with McCloud, introduce the theory, talk a little about the history of comics, because I personally think that the visual style that comics are done in carries some overtones with it that come from the history of comics, then an educated eye is going to look at something that's drawn by Robert Crumb and associate it with a certain mindset and worldview that's different from what Jack comics, but having some background for what that style is gives you as a communicator some more fine-grained levers for the impression that you're trying to create with what you do. From there, I move on to, so we do a module on graphic novels and basically applications of comics to fiction, nonfiction, graphic medicine, stuff like that. I had Ellen Forney as a guest speaker this year talking about graphic medicine stuff. Really like, like sort of interesting and unexpected applications of comics. We do a set on comics as community. So Darlin, like what you're talking about the, talking about conventions and fan engagement and the communities that come with comics. And then finally, we go into comics in the larger media space and how and why comics get adapted into other media, what do successful adaptations look like, what do unsuccessful ones look like, and then how can comics play in a transmedia content strategy where if you're doing a film or an advertising campaign or a web site or something like that, how can you bring comics in as an element into that media mix to spread the story out across those different platforms? And then the students create a proposal for a transmedia project that puts comics at the center on a topic of their choice. And I've had some just amazing, very creative, very interesting and engaging projects come out of this that are, some of them are nonfiction, some of them are fictional stories. There's some really interesting proposals. And so the last part of it is I sort of go through and help them punch up, like, this is what a good pitch looks like. This is what you need in here. This is what you don't need in here. So hopefully by the time they're done with it, they have a professional level, at least they've heard this stuff once in their academic life. So if they get into the workplace, they kind of know a little about what they're doing.
Yeah, great. Wow, that sounds fascinating. Let me ask the second to last question, which I think we can probably deal with quickly. I'm very curious what the other academics think of your comic-focused work at your various colleges and universities. Does anyone have
Try that again, Ed.
I'm curious, what do the other academics think of these courses that you teach? When you sit down with the guy who's like, head of the physics department, and he says, "What do you do?" What is the reaction to these courses that you all teach?
I don't usually get the response of, "That's really cool. I wish they had that when I was here," or something along those lines. And that's usually my response too. I mean, I try to teach the courses I wanted to take.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah,
Oh, Karen, I think, are you speaking? We're not getting you.
Oh, you can't hear it?
I'm sorry.
I usually get a slightly different version of that question because I created the graphic novels collection at Columbia and then started the archive for comics creators in Rare Books. I get a lot of people asking if there was pushback on that or how did people react. And honestly, I've never encountered a moment of pushback or criticism or resentment or anything. Everybody's been supportive. As I built the collection, I had a kind of philosophy of if I build it, they will come.
Yeah.
And that turned out absolutely to be the case. Gradually, I learned about all of these other departments where courses were being taught, not that focused on comics, but that incorporated comics into their reading lists, into their kind of theoretical foundations. So people think that it would be weird, I guess, that Columbia University would have comics courses. I don't think we have enough of them, quite frankly. But we do, and nobody's ever said a word, at least not to my face.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Let me pivot to our last question. I'm very curious. What do you think of for the future? Will there be more comics classes at colleges, universities? Is this the best that it's ever going to get? How is this going to impact colleges in the future? Anxious to hear your thoughts.
I think there's a lot of belief that it will end up as a smaller scale version of film studies.
Mm.
But really what's going to drive that is how deep the penetration of the graphic novel gets. If the generation that's now growing up on Raina and Dav Pilkey keeps that fascination, and we keep producing a wider and wider creative range of graphic novels, this will be a big area. You know, when I look at it as a business guy, manga is close to 40% of the Japanese publishing industry. Bande dessinée is about 14-15% of the Franco-Belgian publishing industry. Traditional comics in America were about 4 to 5% of the American publishing industry. And largely, I believe that's because we were offering only 3 or 4 flavors.
Mm-hmm.
We had vanilla, we had chocolate, we didn't have strawberry, that was too exotic. You know, maybe we had French vanilla. And when you look at a Japanese bookstore, it's way past the 31 flavors of Baskin Robbins.
Sure.
We've got 300 flavors, which permits that. Well, we're seeing creative people expand into many of those gaps. And, you know, some of them are brilliant, but not phenomenally commercial. Some of them are brilliant and commercial.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are there. But if we offer up to the audience a wide enough selection, and we keep an audience in a country that is not very literate to start with, then we'll have a good chunk of academia paying attention to it. Most of the academics that are teaching comics today are relatively younger people who loved comics and are trying to find a way to do it. When I co-teach at Columbia, I co-teach with Jeremy Dauber, who's a tenured professor, impeccable academic credentials. He's a professor of Yiddish, and he'll do pretty much anything not to teach Yiddish at this point in his career. He knows comics really well. He's writing a wonderful book on the history of comics that he's researching far more energetically than anything that I ever researched in the course of my career. But he's, I don't know, Jeremy's 20 years younger than I am. That's what we're seeing across the country. There were a few older guys who were pioneers, gals too. Thomas Inge in Virginia, who was probably the first academic to really study comics in a meaningful fashion, coming off a media studies approach to it. But what we're going to see is we're going to see these young people mature. And if there's an audience of people who believe in the graphic novel, who believe in comics as a form, taking these courses, then we'll get more courses around it. I don't think, one of the things I do when I do the lit course is I always, in the first conversation about it, point out that Tolkien, when he was a literature professor at Oxford, argued against the novel becoming part of the canon of literature because it was too new. I think this argument took place in the 1920s. We're at that stage. You know, there's some people sort of saying, you know, what is this thing that started 2 minutes ago?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's going to be film studies. I think it's going to be more like the computer lab. Remember back in the 80s when if you were like going to school and to learn computers, you went to the computer lab and that's where the computers were? Now it's like everybody just has computers in the classroom, right? Because it's like the medium itself has become transparent. There's still people that take computer science as a thing, just as there will be people that do comic studies as a thing. But I think the strength of the work, it's like if you're teaching a literature class, how are you not teaching Asterios Polyp, or my favorite thing is Monsters, or something like that, as part of a contemporary literature class? How are you not, if you're in psychology, how do you not have marbles as an example of, you know, experiential bipolar, or, you know, African American studies for like Hotcomb or something like that? Like the fact that it's being done as comics makes no difference. It's the quality of the content is going to push it into the curriculum in that way. And everybody it'll just sort of filter through, I think, a lot of these different departments as just one more thing. And if you do want to learn the craft of making comics or the specific discipline of like understanding the medium itself, there is going to be a track of programming like that. But I think that the novelty of comics as a way to get information across, we're coming to the end of that bridge now, and we're going to be out the other side probably in 5 or 10 years.
I would add that there's a growing credential aspect. You've got a Newbery Award winner graphic novel. You've got a National Book Award graphic novel. You've got 5 cartoonists who won MacArthur Genius Awards. These are things that academics will respond to. So I don't think you even have to necessarily wait, as Paul says, for the younger kids to grow up who've been soaking in it, so to speak. But a lot of the faculty that I work with at Columbia are in their late 50s, 60s, and are teaching with comics. They just recognize that this is a medium that has produced some noteworthy and notable works. And why would you ignore them? I've got an English department professor who teaches a film course and uses Berlin, because it's got that visual that fits with the German expressionist thing that she's trying to get them to think about. So we're there, we're there. We've won awards at the same level as, Pulitzer Prize novels and the like. I don't think we have to really worry. We just have to wait for others to kind of catch on to, oh, that's what's happening in that medium? Gosh, yeah, look at that.
Yeah, I would also second that, what Karen's saying, especially our colleague, Catherine Kittredge, who's an English professor at Ithaca College. She's been doing this a long time. This isn't, but I think it also taps into, within just us, there are different disciplines and different departments of higher education utilizing the media, the comics medium, to communicate effectively to their students, whether it's in communications or events or literature, psychology, history. I think the more that higher education can start to break down some of those really rigid department structures, and this is kind of going back to what you were saying, asking us earlier, Ed, about, what have we learned? Higher education is going through a bit of a shakeup right now. And I think if they can start to see some of those cross-disciplinary things, it will help weave a better education for students.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah, fantastic. And I think we're going to have to leave it there. I so wish we could continue this all at the coffee shop or the bar afterwards, but this has been fantastic. I think I've had more fun than anyone who's going to be watching this did. That's great. Let's end up with a quick round, lightning round. If you can tell us one thing that you're working on, it's time to plug. And then also, because this is academia, give a little pitch to make your admissions office happy that this happened. If you could remind us what school or colleges you're associated with. So Karen, please start us off. What are you working on, and where are you working again?
So I'm working from home, but I work for Columbia University.
Great.
The project that I took on to do from home, because it's difficult when your job deals with material culture, to work from home, to not be able to actually be there. We have received several gifts of mini comics collections from M.K. Reed, from Gary Panter, from a collector named Mark Nevins, and then my own. And they've just been sitting in boxes. I've been reluctant to send, several thousand 8-page pamphlets down to our cataloging department, many of which have minimal information on them. So I've been doing an inventory I've got a bunch of boxes sitting in my home right now.
Wow.
I've inventoried about 14 or 1500 so far since I've been home, and I think I'm only about halfway through the collection.
How
Um,
cool. Send up the
but-
Gary Cantor. I'll help you with that box.
no, that's more than one box.
Oh,
And what's nice about it is that it's also, my inventory is generating work for our catalogers who also have to have projects to work at home, because I send them the inventory and they convert those records into MARC records that will then get loaded into our catalog. So soon, several thousand mini comics will be searchable in our catalog.
oh, fantastic. That's great. That's great. Darlene, I know you got a lot of things going on. Just give us the highlight reel and how can people get a hold of you?
Okay, well, comicsinmylife.com, that's my newest project. I'm cataloging certain fan life items. Usually when I'm at events, I spend a lot of my time documenting people in line and talking randomly with people. So I've started cataloging those things and putting them into posts. I've started a graphic novel book club for my 9-year-old. And I've now decided that that's my life. And also I'm really researching fan culture, but particularly comics culture events during the period of COVID-19, spanning from fan originated through professional or for-profit originated. So digitalization and how we're going to get back to the live sphere.
Cool. How fast? That's great. That's good. Frank Camuso, give us your update, please.
Yes, I'm working on the third book of my middle grade graphic novel trilogy. That's not, well, that's
This
next
is
year.
the old one, right?
Yeah, this is the series.
Yeah, love it.
Edison Beaker, Creature Seeker. I'm working on the third and final part of the trilogy. That should be out maybe, I'm not quite sure what, no one is, it was supposed to be 2021, but I think things have, there was this little thing going on. I think it might move back. Somewhere, yeah. And then I'm teaching at Syracuse University. So in the illustration department, you know, you want to learn about comics? You want to draw comics? Come on down. We got them at Syracuse University.
All right. Fantastic. That's great. Good. Paul Levitz, you always have a lot of balls in the air. What's happening with you?
So I teach writing at Manhattanville College. Undergrad, a couple of comics courses, one each term at Pace University, and then Pace's Masters in Publishing program on a graduate level. Have the Columbia course this summer, and in the spring, I think we'll be doing the American Studies version of the American graphic novel at Columbia with Jeremy Dauber again. I do a bunch of other stuff, but the next piece of my writing, two things, the last issues of a series I've been doing for Valiant called The Visitor should come out at the end of the summer, assuming the world reopens appropriately. And then Dark Horse has a finished graphic novel sitting there that was supposed to come out in June that hopefully will make it out by the end of the year. A rabbi, a priest, and a minister walk into a bar, except they're all dead and they're there to find out what their unfinished business is. Drawn by Simon Fraser, which really fits no possible commercial category and probably will sell to about as many people as are watching this panel. But I had a lot of fun doing it, and hopefully people will enjoy reading it.
Oh, I don't know. That's a great hook. That sounds fascinating. Thank you. Rob Selkowitz?
So I'm teaching at the University of Washington Communication Leadership Graduate Program, ComLead as it's known to the public, I guess. And in the fall, I teach Future of Marketing, and in the maybe winter this year, I'll be teaching the comics class again. I just finished teaching that. I have work in Kim Munson's upcoming anthology on comic art in museums. I think Karen has a piece in that as well. I have an essay coming out on this quantitative data analysis of the audience for San Diego Comic-Con versus New York Comic-Con that was done an incredibly long time ago and is probably no longer relevant or interesting in a collection by Ben Wu that has been proceeding at like it's watching glaciers go speeding by, but that should be out by the end of the year. And for my regular work, you can find me in Forbes at ICV2, or if you follow me on Twitter at Rob Salk, in between the deranged political rantings are updates and plugs for the latest stuff that I'm writing.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, love seeing you on ICV2 and Forbes, Rob. That's great. Yeah, my name's Ed Cato. A couple of my recent things are Pirates from Clover Press and Yo Books, and love contributing to Tomorrow's magazines. Great publisher. I'm part of the faculty at Ithaca College, ithaca.edu, where I teach entrepreneurism classes, and this co-teach a great class all about Ithaca and Ithacon, the comic convention. And I grab all these smart people like right here to be guest speakers. So it's a fantastic class. Thank you very much, panelists. We certainly appreciate it. Please stay safe. Have a good summer, and we'll see you when the world opens up again. So thank you very much. Certainly appreciate
Thanks
it.
so much, Ed.
Thank you.